Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York, I'm Scarlet Fu.
And I'm Jill Weisenthal. We're 30 minutes from the close of trading here in the U.S.
U.S. stocks climbing, helped by gains in financial companies, while the euro recovered from early losses as investors largely brushed off the Italian referendum.
But the question is, what'd you miss?
Relative calm in the markets today, underscoring just how much investors had widely priced in the Italian referendum and subsequent resignation of Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. What is next on Europe's watch list? And U.S. President-elect Donald Trump takes a fresh swipe at China, slamming the country over currency and trade and breaking precedents by calling Taiwan's leader. We'll look at some of the consequences of his foreign policy. Plus, CBS CEO Les Moonves sitting down with Bloomberg today, defending the cable television business and why content providers need to be paid fairly. We'll have more highlights from that conversation coming up. Let's get you started with a look at where the major indexes stand as we head towards a close. Abigail Doolittle is standing by, and Abigail, looks like another record high right now for the Dow.
Indeed, Scarlett, we do have the Dow on pace for yet another record closing high. In fact, we have strength for all of the U.S. major averages, not just the Dow, but also the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ gaining the most, really being powered by a recovery in technology shares. And as you had just mentioned, investors really seeming to brush off the Italian referendum and the vote to not make constitutional changes. Now, confirming this picture of risk on among the equity averages, we have the VIX trading sharply lower, in fact, on pace for its worst decline since November 9th and the day after the election. So it's pretty interesting that the volatility gauge is really just dropping off, not just after the election, but also after this Italian referendum, speaking to some complacency there. And it's confirmed as well by pictures of sovereign bonds. We have the U.S. 10-year yield in white, the Italian 10-year yield in orange. This is over the last month. And even though there is a divergence there over toward the side, it seems to tell the same picture. U.S. 10-year bonds are, of course, safe haven bonds, so that spike higher in yield suggests that investors are selling those bonds. They see less of a need for safety, whereas the Italian bond, that's not so much of a safe haven bond. So that the fact that that yield is coming down actually shows us that investors are buying those bonds. In fact, in some ways, buying this news. So pretty interesting there. And returning to the idea of complacency with the VIX, when we go into the Bloomberg and we take a look at #BTV 3204. This is a little more than a one-year chart in the VIX, and we see this big descending trading range. We also see that the VIX, or the fear gauge, spiked higher in the beginning of the year on those macro concerns around a possible slowing economy, spiked higher into the Brexit, and then also spiked higher into the election. But right now, complacency is really taking the VIX back down, suggesting that the VIX could, in fact, carve out an all-new low. It'll be interesting to see whether that happens into the year end. And confirming these pictures of risk on, complacency, finally another chart in the Bloomberg, #BTV 5262. This is a year-to-date chart of the 10-year yield. Again, safe haven. And we see with price trading inverse to yield from the beginning of the year into the Brexit, there was a massive decline in yield. And then we see into the election an increase in yield. So it appears that the Brexit was the true risk-off event of 2016, as investors are now selling safety, not just into the U.S. election, while the Italian referendum appears to be a bit of a non-event. But it is worth noting this massive spike up in yield that we've had since July, more than 1%, it could consolidate. So there could be some volatility ahead for the financial markets, especially right here for the 10-year yield, Scarlet.
All right, we're keeping a close eye on that one. Thank you so much, Abigail. And staying on the Italy news, the reaction to the defeat of Matteo Renzi's constitutional reform referendum was the most orderly to a populist vote, in contrast to the Brexit vote and Trump's surprise election. So this chart really highlights it. It shows how the FX market has reacted to all three events. And the outcome to this latest one was not a huge surprise. Investors were correctly positioned, and that removed the prospect of an overreaction. Of course, Italy, are the blue bars, is a reaction to the Italian referendum. The Trump election, you could see it most clearly in the Mexican peso. The Brexit, obviously, was a shocker, and the pound was pounded.
That's a really great chart, and it just shows, I mean, the markets didn't even waste their time pretending to care about this one. I saw there was a quote today on a story on the Bloomberg. It was like, Brexit took 3 days to get over, Trump took 3 hours, this one took 3 minutes. Maybe if Marine Le Pen wins in France, it'll take 3 seconds, and the markets will shake off that one.
We'll see. In the meantime, Prime Minister Matteo Renzi did offer to resign when he met with the president, Sergio Mattarella, but instead, Mattarella asked him to stay on in the meantime because they want to make sure that they get their budget approved by Parliament before he steps down.
Right. There's a lot of unfinished business left to do for the current government before they can end this government and have a new election, so I guess they want to clean some of that up.
All right. We'll be speaking with Megan Green of Manulife a little bit later on to get her perspective on Italy. She has been in Rome the last couple of days, so she's got some good color from the ground. Coming up, we'll be hearing from CBS's chairman and CEO Les Moonves on what the future looks like for the media giant. This is Bloomberg. UBS's Global Media and Communications Conference is well underway in New York City. Earlier today, Bloomberg's David Weston had a chance to sit down with CBS's chairman and CEO Les Moonves. He asked him what CBS would like to accomplish without owning some distribution. Take a listen.
We are primarily a premium content company. Our job is to do great content for CBS, for Showtime, for the CW, late night, sports, etc. If we do that, all the distributors are going to need us. They're all going to pay us for what we're offering, and we don't necessarily need to be in the distribution business.
Well, all the distributors are going to need you. I mean, for example, AT&T decided they needed Time Warner, and so they went and bought the thing.
They did.
At some point, do you have distributors coming to knock on your door saying, you know what, we need you, CBS, so badly, we don't want to do a license deal, we want to buy you? I'm
sure there are distributors out there who would like to do that right away. As you know, we're a controlled company, by NAI, so that is more difficult. But I could imagine there are plenty of people out there, especially when you see AT&T paying a lot of money for Time Warner, that a company like ours would be very, very valuable in the open market.
But have you had any discussions yet?
I'm not going to say. By the way, you have discussions with everybody, and they all say very nice things about you. But
as you look at the Time Warner AT&T deal, do you have any concerns about it? In the sense that when you have a big distributor like AT&T is, particularly in wireless, they could sort of favor Time Warner content over CBS content.
Look, we're looking at it. It was just announced a few weeks ago. We're taking a good, cold, hard look at it to see if it's advantageous to us or not. So we haven't weighed in yet on what we think about it, and we're looking at it. But
are you open to the possibility of the regulators coming in to have some rules and regulations, the way they did, by the way, with Comcast's NBCU?
Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of regulators. You know, with the FCC going forward, we hope there's a loosening of regulations, and I'd be a proponent of that.
So, moving on, let's talk about DirecTV Now.
Yep.
They've just launched it.
Yep.
They launched it without CBS. There was a lot of talk about whether CBS needed the internet.
They did.
You decided to sit it out. Why?
Well, number one, we've always said we will join any service as long as we get paid fairly and the conditions that we need are met appropriately. We are in active discussions right now with DirecTV. We have different needs than some of our competitors who own a lot of cable networks. You know, our centerpiece is a broadcast network. So there are some financial issues, there are some other issues, such as digital issues. I expect us to make a deal with them. I expect us to be part of it. But once again, we demand to be paid fairly and have a fair deal for our content.
Talking about retransmission consent, which I say, as you've been a pioneer on, you figured out a way to include the broadcast stations in that. As we move into the over-the-top world, right, can the broadcast stations participate, and could that affect the valuation of your stations, for that matter?
I think it's, you know, the great thing about OTT, it's resetting the tables. When we entered the retransmission disputes or negotiations, they already were paying a lot of money to different cable networks, and we were coming in after the party started. Now that there's a brand new party, we're the most watched network. You know, the broadcast networks should be paid more than the cable stations should be, because more eyeballs should mean more pay. So we intend to be on every over-the-top service, but we don't think any of them can exist successfully without CBS, without getting the NFL or Big Bang or NCIS or Stephen Colbert or 60 Minutes, that we are a necessary part of any package.
So when distributors go for those content deals, historically, they've wanted an advantage. They're building a new business. The way to get that is to have exclusive content so that their rival distributor doesn't have it.
Correct.
How often does that come up? Are you willing to give exclusivity?
No, that's where a problem comes in. Stacking rights, the ability to get all the shows of a certain season, we only have on All Access. You know, it's not to say if somebody made us a very high offer for that it would be available, but exclusivity is really tough for us.
And that was David Weston speaking with CBS Chairman and CEO Les Moonves.
Discovery Communications CEO David Zaslav also joined David Weston earlier today. He asked about the future of content in the wake of the AT&T and Yahoo deal.
There's no question that if you close your eyes and open it up in 3 or 4 years, almost every provider, the person that gives you your mobile is going to give you your broadband. They're going to be giving you your multi-channel to the home. So this idea of the quad play, we're seeing it play out across Europe much more aggressively. The AT&T deal, I think, is another indication that every cable operator is going to need a mobile solution, whether they own it or not. And you see it in Latin America as well. And so this pipe that used to be multi-channel, this pipe is now, then it became hard phone, then broadband. The person that sells you the pipe in the long run is going to sell you everything. And so I think the AT&T deal really stands for the power of that. The second thing that I think is more important for us as a content company is it talks about the real value and how important content is to decommoditize that pipe. The problem as this consolidation of the pipe happens around the world is that the ability to get margin on that pipe. If you're sitting in France and you can get 3 different choices of a pipe that gives you all 4 of those, and they could all give you decent speed, and you can and good mobile signal. Like, what's the difference? And so the only way to get scale is to either reduce price, which is what's going on now around the world, and which is why most of the mobile players have no margin in their business, or decommoditize that pipe with content. And that's where I think we come in a big way. That's why being the leader in sports in Europe, and you've already seen it happen. BT has been buying sports. Sky now is getting into mobile, and they own sports. You know, Deutsche Telekom is looking at getting into sports. Vodafone, Telenor. So if you just have a pipe, it's not going to be enough. You need some exclusive IP.
That was David Zaslav, CEO of Discovery.
All right, we're keeping track of the markets here. Stocks in the U.S. and Europe advancing, along with the euro erasing its early loss. Investors clearly looking past political turmoil in Italy. The Dow Industrials on its way to another record high. Car makers and miners leading gains in Europe, even as Italy, where the Italian benchmark stock index did decline after Matteo Renzi resigned as prime minister. That opens the door, of course, to a new government and fresh elections.
Remarkable reaction. Joining us now on the phone is Megan Green, chief economist at Manulife Asset Management. We're going to talk more about Italy. Megan is in Rome following the election. Megan, thank you very much for calling in. Here's my question. How big of a deal is this? I've seen some people say this is not really that big of a deal. It doesn't really open the door to anything bad. Other people saying this is a huge rejection of the euro and establishment parties yet again. Where do you fall on this question?
So I'm going to fall somewhere down the middle. I would say that a lot will depend on how the government handles Monte Paschi di Siena. So it's Italy's third largest bank. It's in pretty bad shape. They had come up with a private sector solution to rescue the bank, but actually it looks like it's very possible that the consortium of investors who were meant to underwrite that deal might pull out. And if that's the case, then the government doesn't handle it swiftly and credibly, you could see contagion spread to some of Italy's other banks, including UniCredit, which is expected to announce an over 10 billion euro capital rights issue next week. And so if UniCredit has trouble getting that capital rights issue off, you could easily see contagion spread beyond Italy. And don't forget that Deutsche Bank was on the front page of every newspaper about 2 months ago until suddenly it wasn't, but nothing has fundamentally changed there. So there are certainly systemically important banks elsewhere that might have trouble as well. So that's the real risk, I think. But the longer-term risk is that Italy doesn't grow at all. And to some degree, that's just business as usual in Italy. Italy's used to not growing. It's used to political instability. So I think this is being viewed maybe with more drama abroad than it is here in Italy.
So more of the usual in any case. For those of us in the financial markets or watching the financial markets, we're used to thinking about the Italian referendum and Matteo Renzi resigning and the Italian banks kind of in a direct line. You've been in Rome for a couple of days now. To what extent is the rest of the populace making that connection between the vote and the Italian banks?
So, I mean, those more informed are making the connection, certainly, between the referendum and the electoral law, actually, which is connected to the referendum. With the referendum, the no vote winning, the electoral law has to be completely rewritten, which changes the politics a lot. And, of course, also looking at the banks. But there was a survey done shortly before the referendum that showed that only 1 in 10 Italians was actually planning to vote with the actual constitutional reform in mind. Everybody else was voting about something else. And to a large degree, people were just voting either for Renzi or for something else, since Renzi had said he would step down if the no vote won, which, of course, it did. So to some degree, it's a vote for something other than what they have. Right. So nobody had to specify what that was.
Right. This seems like a common theme. I mean, even similar with the UK referendum, where there was a clear idea of what staying in the EU meant, staying in, but lots of different ideas about what leaving could mean. What is the side that won here? Was it an anti-Euro thing? Was it just anti-Renzi? Was it anti-establishment? Which force emerges the strongest from this victory?
So I think it was mainly anti-establishment and anti-status quo. I don't think it was an anti-Euro vote. And ironically, actually, those who voted no in the referendum, so therefore voted along the lines of the populist Five-Star Movement, actually made it pretty difficult for the Five-Star Movement to ever come into government. So given that the constitutional reform was defeated, now the electoral law has to be totally rewritten. But if it had stood as it was, that was the only realistic path for the Five-Star Movement to run the government. So now that path is totally blocked.
So the Five-Star Movement has less of a chance to become the next government. That being the case, what happens to Matteo Renzi? Is his political career in Italy over, or might he be able to make a comeback later on?
I think it's incredibly likely that Renzi will be back. He's only 41. He's got a long career ahead of him. So I think he'll be back in the next election. Whether it happens at the end of this legislature in May 2018, or it might happen a little bit early. Some are saying that after they agree a new electoral law, they might have a snap election in Q2 of next year. But either way, Renzi will probably be a big player.
All right, so what's your assessment of the next steps in Italy? Obviously, some want a snap election. Others say that can't really happen. They have to do this new electoral law. When's your guess for when we will see a new national election in Italy? And how would you, at this point, handicap that race?
So I think the first thing that they need to do is choose a new prime minister, and I think either a technocrat or more likely some candidate acceptable to the entire PD, the center-left party, will be instilled. And I think the most likely candidate would be Padoan, the finance minister, and that actually would be positive for those worried about Italy's banks, since he's already been dealing with the banks for quite a while. Once they have a prime minister, I think they'll go ahead and try to reform the electoral law. And then somewhere in the middle of next year, they might have a snap election. I think it would be a better idea for Italy to wait until the end of this legislature in 2018 to have an election so that actually a new government can come to power with a mandate and not be stuck trying to negotiate with their partners in Europe in the midst of a French and German election. So I think they should wait until 2018, but they might actually go ahead and have one earlier.
All right, Megan Green, thank you so much. Chief Economist at Manulife Asset Management, joining us by phone from Rome. We'll have more on India and Japanese stocks. This is Bloomberg. I'm Scarlet Fu. What'd you miss? In the UK and the US, we've seen banks take a leadership role as the equity market rallied and as you have the bonds sell off and yields rise. That's starting to happen in Japan as well. Our thanks to Chris Verone of Strategas for coming up with this chart. So the white line is the Topix Bank Index. That's the Japanese banks as a ratio, in a ratio versus the Topix Index overall. So when the line goes up, that means banks are outperforming. When the line goes down, banks are underperforming. The blue line is the JGB 10-year yield. And you can see that both have been moving up since the U.S. election in November. Matt, if we come over here, you can really see that leg higher in November. But actually, if you go back to late July, that's when it really began taking off. And that was when the BOJ disappointed investors by not expanding its quantitative easing program. JGBs declined, pushing those yields up, and the yen surged in value. Now you've got JGBs continuing to drop off. They're selling off, so those yields are rising. But the yen is weakening because of this stampede into the U.S. dollar following the U.S. election, Joe.
Great chart. Really shows what a global phenomenon this rising banks, strong yields are other way around. I'm looking at India. We don't talk about their PMI numbers very often on this show, but they have a monthly PMI like everyone else. This is the monthly change in the India Services PMI. If we go all the way to the end here, we see is the biggest ever drop in the history of the index. and the culprit, the demonetization scheme of the Modi government, really having a hit on the economy as all these people have to bring their large denomination rupees in for exchange into the bank. You can see, I mean, this drop is just way out of proportion for anything we've seen in the history of this thing. So it really shows, you know, it's going to be temporary, it'll pass at some point, but having a real short-term economic impact.
It's the unintended consequence number 836.
Right, there's so many fascinating things happening due to this policy.
All right, the market closes next here in the United States. Take a look at the major indexes. With less than 4 minutes to go before the close, the Dow on its way to another record close, up 45 points at 19,215. The NASDAQ flying high, up by better than 1%. This is Bloomberg. We're moments away from the closing bell. What'd you miss? The Dow closes at a record high as investors basically look past the political turmoil in Italy. This rotation into riskier assets sparked by the U.S. election continues. I'm Scarlet Fu.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. We want to welcome our viewers who are turning in live on Twitter. You can watch our closing bell coverage on Twitter every weekday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
We begin with our market minutes. As we mentioned, the Dow Jones Industrial Average finding its way to another record high. The S&P 500, for its part, not closing at its all-time high, but it's at its best level since November 25th. And the NASDAQ was the star performer of the three, the best gain since November 15th. You know, no news is good news, I suppose, or everyone had priced in the Italian referendum.
Must have been all priced in. Markets didn't even bother pretending to care about that.
They just looked past it completely.
Yeah, pretty stunning.
If you look at the different sectors, energy shares had been one of the leaders earlier in the session. They kind of faded a little bit into the close, still up by 0.9%. Financials were the big winners here, and they continue to really lead the market here as yield curves steepen, and people certainly in the United States speculate that President-elect Donald Trump will loosen regulation and roll back a lot of the regulation that held back the financial sector. I also included the ETF that tracks Italian stocks. It opened lower. It erased losses within the first 30 minutes. The gains, however, were capped by big losses in banks. You had 3 of the 4 worst performing performers in the stock 600 in Europe as Italian banks.
A bit of a reversal today. Let's look at government bonds, starting with the 2-year and 10-year yields in the U.S. And we have yields ending just slightly higher on the day. They had been higher earlier in the morning. We got strong economic data out of the U.S. when we got non-manufacturing PMI at its highest level since October 2015. That caused yields to initially shot up. But as you can see, by the end of the day, essentially flat on the day.
Essentially flat. Okay.
And I want to go in real quickly into the Bloomberg to talk about Italy. This is the Italian-German spread, 10-year yield. And that's probably the cleanest sort of expression of risk. You can see we did shoot up instantly right after the referendum went down. But then the spread started to narrow again. And in fact, spreads on this Italian-German 10-year are actually lower than where they were just last Thursday. Just gives you a real sort of indication of how little this result ended up affecting the market.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, again, you also have the European Central Bank as the backstop for Italian bonds as well, so that
helps.
helps.
That probably helps a little bit. Still, kind of remarkable level of calm.
And speaking of that calm, let's take a look at euro dollar. This is the 2-day chart on it, and you can see that the euro finished Friday little change today. It gapped lower at the start of Asian trading. It fell to as low as 105.05. That is a 20-month low. It then recovered pretty quickly as European trading began. Lots of different explanations on why the euro recovered so quickly. David Zervos of Jefferies says his favorite explanation is that a euro that is less likely to contain Italy is actually a stronger euro. Now, there are a lot of steps in between there.
It's a long time for a
but it's one explanation. The euro also gaining versus other major currencies. You can see it versus the yen, versus the Swissy, and versus the pound. All higher there, all green arrows there for the euro strengthening versus those currencies.
Looks like parity is going to have to wait for a little while. Let's take a look at commodities. Not a ton of action, though copper continues to power ahead, up another 2.5%. Industrial metals, as you know, have been for the last several weeks have been doing very well. Gold and oil both slipping a little bit, but West Texas Intermediate remains above $51 a barrel.
All right, we'll continue monitoring that as well. Those are today's Market Minutes. What'd you miss? President-elect Donald Trump's phone call with the Taiwan leader marked a break with almost 4 decades of U.S.-Chinese diplomatic protocol. Trump told his 16.6 million Twitter followers that he would not be told by China on who he should or shouldn't talk to. The UN reacted by declining for the first time in 3 days. Joining us now is Jamie Metzl. He is a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. He served on the U.S. National Security Council and State Department during the Clinton administration. And we also have with us Nick Consineri, lead analyst for Asia in the geopolitical intelligence team at FTI Consulting. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Jamie, let me start with you. Do you presume that the Trump camp fully understood all the ramifications of Donald Trump's phone call on Friday with Tsai Ing-wen and they intended to rattle Beijing?
No.
Short answer, no.
So if they did, let's just say, let's give the benefit of the doubt to the Trump team. And they had said that the United States has been too accommodative of China. And there was going to be some kind of strategic review. Would this really be the way that they would want to introduce that review? Would President-elect Trump really want to respond and say, oh, I can take a call from anybody? China has a lot of tricks up their sleeve, and this is a very delicate, very strategic relationship. So in my view, there may be some ideology that's woven its way through this process, but it's a very, very dangerous first step.
Nick, what do you make of that? Because it certainly doesn't seem like Trump is averse to antagonizing the Chinese. That was a big part of his campaign. This sort of ripping up the playbook and doing things by surprise also seems very much how he wants to act. Do you think there was something deeper, or do you think this was just sort of a weird thing that happened?
Well, look, I think it was intentional. I mean, I think his team has been advocating for a pro-Taiwan position for the better part of the past year. Whether he personally had signed on to that policy position, I think we can maybe question. But I actually think the bigger story here about the Trump administration and China policy is not going to be about Taiwan. I think it's very clear that Trump himself believes in taking a much harder line position vis-a-vis China on economic and trade issues, and Taiwan's not going to be the flashpoint. I think this is a side story to this much bigger issue of the economic economic relationship.
It might be a side story, but Trump referenced this in one of his tweets, that the U.S. sells billions of dollars of military equipment to Taiwan. Do you think this was a motivation in why he made this phone call, even if it was intentional to rattle China?
Yeah, well, I think he believes that it's true. I think he and his team have made it very clear that they feel that the U.S. Administration should not be constrained in terms of who they communicate with, and certainly at this stage of the transition, they felt like they had some space to do that.
Jamie, why have administrations felt they had to be so constrained on this issue? Why not talk to whoever we want to talk to?
Well, it's a nice principle in life to talk to anybody.
Right.
But the United States presidents, Ford, Nixon, Carter, made a very complicated treaty relations and negotiations with China. And we agreed at the height of the Cold War to this set of relationships between China and Taiwan. And if we are deciding, we, the United States government, are deciding to renegotiate that, we should do it based on a strategy. And a lot of the world, stability and security in the world, depends on people's belief that the United States will stand by its commitments, both for our allies but also for our adversaries. If we're saying that we are now going to do foreign policy by tweet based on a whim or based on ideology, when we're not bringing the full force of U.S. government expertise and strategic planning to bear, we're going to be the loser of that new world.
But ultimately, it is Trump's prerogative. If he wants to create a new world, create a new U.S. foreign policy, it's on him. I mean, it's his call, right?
It's absolutely the president or the president-elect's prerogative.
Right.
The question is just, is it smart to do it this way, or is it not smart? It seems to me this is a not smart way to do it.
And I actually think there's a deeper truth here, right, which is that the Obama administration, we talked about their rebalance to Asia. I think what we're seeing is that the Trump administration is going to reboot the relationship, right? They're rebooting the relationship with China. They're starting from scratch on some of these fundamental issues, and we are absolutely entering uncharted waters.
Yeah, but the other side has a vote, so we can reboot. But China can respond. Right now, for example, there's a truce between China and Taiwan on the 22 countries that recognize Taiwan. Let's just say that China says, all right, we're going to knock off 10 of those countries, get 10 of those countries in Latin America, primarily, to recognize China versus Taiwan. That's a major blow to Taiwan, and that's going to be on Trump's shoulders. So what are we going to do? So it's not a good idea. It's probably a bad idea. But if we haven't thought about the repercussions, it's very, very dangerous to do things this way.
Nick, what does this mean for other countries in the Asia-Pacific? What does it mean for Japan, for Korea, for the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore? How will they capitalize on this tension?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this is just a period of a significant increase in uncertainty for all of those countries as they try to interpret what exactly the policies of the Trump administration are going to be for the region. So that's the overarching story. I think if we looked at the individual countries, the country that has been the most successful in getting out front of this is clearly Japan, where Shinzo Abe had the sit-down, the personal meeting, the first meeting of a foreign head of state with Trump. I think that was a huge success for them.
Jamie, talk more about the potential ramifications of conducting foreign policy this way. You say, you know, the world looks to us to have clear commitments to both our allies and our potential antagonists. What happens when the world perceives us as not necessarily sticking to what we've said in the past?
Well, we don't really know. The world for the last 70 years, particularly big chunks of Asia and Europe, have existed under an American security umbrella. America has never had a large enough military to enforce every commitment.
Right.
So it was people's belief that the United States could or would stand by its commitments that really undergirded so much of the world that we know today. And if President-elect Trump is just saying, well, we may or may not honor those types of commitments, whether to our allies or our adversaries, that's putting us in a very new world. And if our adversaries or allies believe that that's the case, then we're going to go back to this balance of power world that existed before the Second World War, and we know how that world ends.
What kind of specific challenges does this create for Donald Trump's Secretary of State, whoever that person may be, because he's not done canvassing the field for a potential secretary?
Well, the Secretary of State is going to have a very difficult job because they are trying to manage relations and manage historic relations. There's a whole institution, the State Department, that is dedicated to massaging these very, very long-term relationships. And if you have a president-elect or a president who is lobbing bombs at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's a very, very difficult situation. The good news is somebody who I have a tremendous level of respect and trust for, John Huntsman, has now entered the list of potential candidates for Secretary of State. Having somebody who understands Asia, understands China, understands Taiwan, as well as John Huntsman, particularly if this is the first step, I think that would certainly calm attitudes across the region.
That can't be underestimated. All right, Jamie Metzl, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, Nick Consineri, Lead Analyst for Asia in the Geopolitical Intelligence Team at FTI Consulting. Stick with us. We're going to look at the potential consequences of a more challenging U.S.-China relationship. The Dow closing at a record high, up 46 points at 19,216. This is Bloomberg.
Nina Melendez. Let's get to Bloomberg's First Word News. In Charleston, South Carolina, a mistrial has been declared in the case of a white former police officer charged with murder in the shooting of a black motorist. The jury said it was unable to unanimously agree on a verdict for Michael Slager. He was standing trial for killing 50-year-old Walter Scott after stopping him for a broken taillight. Cell phone video of the shooting that was taken by a bystander sparked national outrage. In Oakland, California, authorities now say 36 people died in a fire at a late-night warehouse dance party, and firefighters expect to find more bodies in the ruins. Up to 100 people may have been inside the building known as the Ghost Ship when the blaze erupted. The cause remains unknown. It's the deadliest fire in the U.S. in more than a decade. In North Carolina, Governor Pat McCrory has lost his bid for re-election. McCrory conceded today, clearing the way for Democrat Roy Cooper to be declared the winner. The concession comes nearly 4 weeks after Election Day, and after appeals dried up and post-election recounts saw Cooper's narrow lead increase. In France, Prime Minister Manuel Valls will run for president in next year's election. He'll face other contenders in the socialist primary next month. The 54-year-old says he'll quit his job Tuesday in order to focus on his presidential bid. Last week, President François Hollande, suffering from historically low approval ratings, said he would not stand for re-election. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nina Melendez. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Thanks, Nina. We're back with Jamie Metzl, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, and Nick Consineri with FTI FTI Consulting. Nick, I want to start with you. We've talked about the sort of Trump, Taiwan, China stuff from the perspective of what the U.S. should do. How is this being perceived internationally? Let's start with what the perception is in Taiwan.
Well, I think in Taiwan, this is obviously a big victory for Tsai Ing-wen, the president. I mean, she came into office this year with some big hopes about economic reform. Those reforms have been going pretty slowly, so she needed a booster of popularity. I think this is going to be very well received.
And in fact, her approval rating was sagging before these photos cropped up of her speaking on the phone with Donald Trump.
Right, exactly. And there's been a lot of criticism of her team, particularly around the premier. And, they need to do a lot of difficult reforms, so it's not an easy environment, and this is a big win.
Jamie, in China, we haven't really seen much of a reaction yet. Seems like it's been pretty muted yet. Do you expect to see more of a reaction from the Chinese government, or do you expect them to sort of wait and see whether this develops, or this is sort of a blip?
Well, it's been muted so far, but there's even been an escalation over the last couple of days. And there will be pressure on the Chinese government from their own nationalist bloggers and others to respond. But we should keep in mind, China is an extremely strategic international power. They have been waiting for opportunities for the United States to trip up so that they could take some steps and the world would say, all right, they were provoked. And so, again, as I was saying before, if we are taking these steps, if we are poking at China and we don't have a strategy for how we are going to respond when they respond, that's a very, very difficult place to be. And I'm sure there are a lot of meetings that are happening now in Beijing about how to manage this process.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with Jamie on that. I just think there's one important issue, though, which is that China is entering its own period of political transition, right? So there's this massive turnover coming up in the Communist Party in the fall of 2017. And I think there's one line of thinking that this is an opportunity for Xi. He gets to show a harder line and get some support from that. But it also might leave him vulnerable, right? I think net, he probably doesn't want a big fallout in relations with the U.S. at this critical juncture for them.
He doesn't, but he can't look weak right now because there are the nationalists who are putting a lot of pressure on Xi because he's breaking a lot of eggs in China, particularly with his anti-corruption drive. And the worst place that he can be is being soft on a core nationalist issue like Taiwan. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Xi to seem tough and strategic. And Donald Trump, in some ways, is the same thing. He has campaigned as a strongman. And so my view is that he probably made a mistake. In retrospect, made a mistake. But he keeps doubling down. And so when there's a little bit of criticism, it's a little stronger tweet. And everything is getting stronger. And if there's a situation of escalation and counter-escalation, that's going to be bad for the United States because China cares about Taiwan in some ways more than the United States does.
It could spiral quickly out of control. Nick, give us an update on where Xi and Tsai Ing-wen's administration stand, because Tsai Ing-wen is, of course, from the Democratic People's Party, which, of course, had once advocated for independence. But since then, they've kind of made their position a little bit more nuanced, their nationalism. It's not quite seeking outright independence from China anymore, is it?
Right. Well, I think we can say that, expectations when Tsai was elected were quite negative. And I think the Xi team has done a little bit better job than many people gave them credit for at managing the dynamics of this relationship that didn't create, in a way that didn't create some massive immediate crisis. It's still, I think, on a negative trajectory vis-a-vis where we would be with the KMT administration.
Jamie, real quickly, what does this mean for areas where the U.S. would like to work with China, say on North Korea, or theoretically, maybe not this administration, but stuff like climate change, stuff like that?
So the United States, I think there are people on the Trump team who are saying we'll get a little bit more leverage over China if our relationship with Taiwan is variable. At the same time, there are a lot of things that we want from China. We need, and we're asking for help on North Korea. On the South China Sea, the United States is saying, and President-elect Trump is saying, that we're going to have a tougher line. But China has a lot of cards to play. China has friends in the region, maybe not as close as the United States. But China has a lot of levers, and they are going to use those levers if they see the United States being more aggressive, which it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means we need to be thoughtful about how we do it.
So the Trump administration hasn't even fully taken office yet, Nick, but it's kind of set the tone here with Sino-U.S. relations. What kind of Secretary of State would be best positioned, or who would be the best person as Secretary of State to navigate these waters?
Well, look, I think clearly we want to have someone that has significant experience with the China relationship. relationship. I mean, I do believe this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and we're in a period of increased uncertainty and volatility. So that's, I think, a key criterion.
All right, Nick Consonnery, lead analyst for Asia in the Geopolitical Intelligence Team, and Jamie Metzel, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you both so much for a great conversation.
Coming up next is upending decades of diplomatic relations with our biggest trading partner, the worst-case scenario in 2017. We'll look at 3 other events to watch for in Bloomberg's Pessimist's Guide to 2017. This is Bloomberg.
What do you miss? 2016 brought us Donald Trump and Brexit, but there may be a lot more in store next year for people to worry about. Bloomberg's executive editor for international government, John Frere, has helped put together a pessimist guide to 2017. So I feel like people are already kind of worried and pessimistic about the state of the world, and now you've written up you've published a guide how things could get even more crazy and worse. So let's start with some of them. We just talked about China from a geopolitical standpoint. What would, one of them on your list is a trade war between U.S. and China.
That's right. Well, part of this exercise is it's actually, they're not necessarily predictions, but they're more, we're encouraging our readers to sort of think through the risk implications of next year. So one of the scenarios we've looked at is this idea that Donald Trump, perhaps even on the morning of his inauguration, could launch a trade war with China via Twitter. And of course, the problem with all of this...
I laugh, but it's actually not that funny.
It actually very nearly became true over last weekend. So this sort of comes to show you how these scenarios, which are supposed to get people to think outside the box, are actually pretty close to reality.
Always scary when the things that are supposed to be crazy are very
It could very much quickly escalate, and in addition to that, the U.S. could be distracted and not deal with something like North Korea, which is a looming threat.
That's right. Well, that is one of the issues that we know people in Washington are talking about, this idea that, that the North Korean regime may actually be a lot closer than people think to actually not only miniaturizing a nuclear warhead, but actually fitting it on top of a missile that could actually hit the West Coast. And, of course, that could play into Trump's whole China policy, because the only way to really rein in North Korea is through Beijing.
This is not to make light of it, but don't their rockets usually go a mile into the sea?
That is
Do they
true.
actually have the technology, theoretically, that could go that far?
There is speculation in South Korea that they might be closer to it than you might think. And also, if you're the president, do you really want to take that risk if it's happening on your watch?
We were just showing the graphic of how that might unfold. North Korea and pandemonium breaking out there. You have in the middle frame Islamic State exploits move. Explain what that means.
Well, yes. I mean, one of the big vacuum, one of the ideas that we explore in the Pessimist Guide is this idea of America retreating from the world. And some people are talking about Islamic State in Afghanistan. They could perhaps choose to sort of tap into the drug money-making machine there. So that's another thing that we could. That's a possible scenario.
Another scenario that you have in terms of outside-the-box thinking, you call it Yalta 2.0. Right. What's this?
This is the idea. This is looking at Eastern Europe and spheres of influence within Eastern Europe. So if you look at this from the perspective of Angela Merkel, for decades now, Western Europe has been essentially relying on America's nuclear shield or military shield to sort of expand the West's sphere of influence into Eastern Europe. Certainly this has been the case since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But imagine a scenario in which Donald Trump carries through his election threat or sort of the implication that the U.S. might withdraw some of its support for NATO.
And he talked about that in the election.
He's talked about that. And that could put Angela Merkel in a very tricky position. It could put her into a position where she has to decide, does Western Europe and Germany arm up against the threat, against the Russian threat, or does she learn to do deals with Vladimir Putin and essentially accept the fact that Russia's sphere of influence does actually expand through Ukraine and right up to NATO's borders. So we could see sort of a reorientation of the politics of Eastern Europe, just like we saw after World War II.
And of course, in Western Europe, we saw Matteo Renzi tender his resignation, even though that's been put on hold for the while. We also have elections coming up next year in the Netherlands and in France, and we could very well see the populists triumph again.
So certainly Marine Le Pen can't be ruled out after the year that we've seen. Look at the UK. There's a lot of potential there for instability. Theresa May would appear to be in a very strong position right now. But if you look at her government, they're completely divided over Brexit. So there is the possibility there that her position might not necessarily be as strong as it might seem.
Could Kurt Wilders win in the Netherlands?
Certainly he could. His party could be the largest party. If you look at the polls, I mean, the polls are certainly, if you believe them, his party are doing well, and it's not really that much of a flight of fancy to imagine them coming top.
What would be the straw that breaks the camel back in terms of breaking up Schengen?
Well, if you saw another major refugee crisis, but also I think the most important thing to look at here, if you look at the euro, if you look at Schengen, these massive pillars of the EU integration project, it's difficult. If you get a government in one of the major Western European countries that's fundamentally opposed to these pillars, that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back there.
All right, John Ferrer, Bloomberg's executive editor, fascinating study, scenarios that certainly seem frighteningly plausible. Thank you very much.
I'm going to shiver when I go to sleep tonight. All right, up next, Toll Brothers releases earnings before the U.S. opening bell tomorrow. We're going to discuss if soaring mortgage rates will affect the largest U.S. luxury builder. This is Bloomberg.
Nina Melendez. Let's get to Bloomberg's First Word News. In Charleston, South Carolina, a mistrial has been declared in the case of a white former police officer charged with murder in the shooting of a black motorist. The jury said it was unable to unanimously agree on a verdict for Michael Slager. He was standing trial for killing 50-year-old Walter Scott in North Charleston after stopping him for a broken taillight. Cell phone video of the incident that was taken by a bystander sparked national outrage. Former U.S. Vice President Al Gore at Trump Tower in New York City today. He met with President-elect Donald Trump in what Gore said was a, quote, lengthy and very productive session.
The bulk of the time was with President-elect Donald Trump. I found it an extremely interesting conversation and to be continued. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Gore earlier sat down with Ivanka Trump reportedly to discuss climate change. In 2007, Gore shared a Nobel Peace Prize with the UN International Planet on Climate Change for his work on the subject. The Army Corps of Engineers has handed a victory to protesters who want to stop an oil pipeline in North Dakota. The engineers refused to grant an easement that would let the pipeline be built under a lake. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe says the project would threaten its water source and cultural sites. Donald Trump supports the pipeline, and his staff says the decision will be reviewed. Italian President Sergio Mattarella has asked Premier Matteo Renzi to put his resignation on hold pending budget approval by Parliament. Renzi says he's quitting after voters overwhelmingly rejected a referendum he'd called to push through constitutional reforms. Polls show that if there's an early election, the anti-Euro five-star movement would gain power. And Shinzo Abe will become the first sitting Japanese prime minister to visit Pearl Harbor. He'll visit the Hawaiian naval base with President Obama at the end of the month. Wednesday marks the 75th anniversary of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, which pulled the U.S. into World War II. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nina Melendez. This is Bloomberg. Scarlet?
Thanks so much, Nina. Let's get a recap of today's market action. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closing at yet another record high. The S&P 500 also finishing up for a second day. Car makers and miners led gains in Europe, and this is even after Matteo Renzi's referendum did not go his way, and he offered his resignation. It was
Nobody cared. Nobody cared except some Italian bank stocks. What'd you miss? Italy's president has asked Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to put his resignation on hold today. Renzi's referendum defeat is the latest in a succession of global anti-establishment victories we've seen this year. Earlier on Bloomberg Daybreak Americas, Olivier Blanchard, former chief economist of the IMF, spoke about the signals sent from Italy's referendum results.
It seems to me that the signal from the results, not the fact that the no won, but it was a 60-40 outcome, really says that there are deep issues in Europe in general, in Italy in particular. And my sense is I'm much less optimistic than the market this morning.
Yeah, and the market is nowhere near where the stress where it was back in 2012. What would be the recipe and the circumstances where we'd see a repeat of the European sovereign debt crisis that we saw in 12?
I think the form it takes is that there is, again, a lot of unhappiness. That's what we saw in the referendum. It's not there only in Italy. It's there elsewhere as well for slightly different reasons depending on the country, but it's there, which means that there's a good chance that you get populist governments elected. I mean, in Italy, it's not an impossibility. In other countries, it's not either. These governments may well decide to go on policies which don't make much sense, which worry markets. Markets start putting large spreads on sovereign bonds, and at some stage there is a crisis, and then the issue is how is it resolved? Is it resolved through debt restructuring, or is it resolved through exit from the euro? I don't think this scenario should be ruled out. My sense is that that kind of scenario we're very likely to see over the coming years, not the coming weeks, but the coming years.
So what you referred to as an exit from the euro, which is one possibility. Is the EU itself in an existential situation? I mean, is there a real threat to the European Union holding together?
I think, well, you have to distinguish between the European Union, which I think will stay, is a fundamentally sound construction. It has to work out how it it operates. There are improvements to be made, but that's going to remain. The euro is a technical construction where the constraint is the common currency, the fixed exchange rate. I think that's what is in peril. This is what may disappear, or at least apply to a much smaller group of countries in the future. I think we have to separate the two.
Olivia, how can we separate the two? It's an important question, I think. You really see a disintegration of the Eurozone, but the European Union remains intact. How will those two things happen?
I mean, I see no logical problem with it. You can get rid of some technical arrangements and keep the rest. It would clearly, I mean, exit from the euro, even if it's done all together, is going to be a very complex and messy process. But you can keep all the rest, which is the single market, freedom to move from country to country, the uniformization of various rules. All this you can keep. Now, getting out of the euro, either individually or together, is an incredibly complex task.
Well, that's the destination then. Let's talk about the potential journey. In the bond market, quite clearly, the Eurozone debt market has been heavily insulated by the actions of the European Central Bank. What would be the trigger point to lead towards a Eurozone exit? Take Italy, for instance. It's not in the Constitution currently to allow them to have that kind of referendum. So I just wonder, Olivia, how do you see a Eurozone exit taking place? And what is the pain trade? What is the trigger point for that, if not the bond market?
You know, I think that the institutions can be adapted to the circumstances. I think the most likely scenario is in some country it looks as if growth is not coming back, the fiscal situation is not under control, the government doesn't seem to be ready to do what it takes. You get the spreads to increase. This means that the country has to go into a program with what's known as the ESM and maybe the IMF. A program is put in place, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. At some point, the kind of discussion which took place in the context of Greece behind the scene come back into play, which is the program going to work? Are we going to be able to get growth going? If not, maybe there should be a plan B. I think this is the kind of scenario that I envisage. Which country will be affected by it? I'm not sure it will be Italy, or it would be Italy, but it's going to be some of these countries which are really struggling to go back to growth. They have another value currency. They have done enormous efforts. They still have very low growth. The potential for populist governments to come to power is there. I think this is the kind of scenario that I envisage.
That was Olivier Blanchard, former IMF chief economist. Scarlet, you're looking now at U.S. housing?
That's right, Joe. We have indeed seen softer data on U.S. home sales and a spike in mortgage rates. We saw purchases of new homes in October fall to a 4-month low, while the 30-year fixed mortgage rate rose above 4%. So what does that mean for home builders? Let's dig into Toll Brothers in today's The Numbers Don't Lie. So the U.S. election accelerated the sell-off in treasuries, pushing yields and mortgage rates higher. According to Freddie Mac, the 30-year fixed rate now is at its highest since July of 2015. It's closing in on 4.1%. This sudden spike in borrowing costs may have a damping effect on prices of new homes. Those are the yellow bars there. Existing homes are orange bars. New homes, of course, have bounced back from the financial crisis. But the thing is, new home shoppers are likely to reduce the amount that they spend on things like options and upgrades, and that trickles down into the economy. Now, Toll Brother customers are not exactly your average home buyer. They're less sensitive to interest rates. Toll is the biggest U.S. luxury home builder, and its buyers tend to be more financially secure. About 22% of Toll's buyers pay in cash. The remaining 78% put down 30% down. Still, if you look at Toll's stock, it is one of the worst performers in the home building sector. Large cap builders as a whole are struggling this year, but you can see Toll, which is the first bar there, rose 4% today to make up some of those losses, but still pretty dismal returns. Partly because of that price drop, Toll is trading at a discount on a price-to-book basis to most of its large-cap homebuilder peers. That could present an opportunity for value investors. Now, in the previous quarter, Toll delivered more than 1,500 homes. That is up 6%, while the average selling price was $843,000. Net signed contracts rose 18% to more than 1,700 units. All these numbers reflect the unit growth comeback that we've seen since the housing collapse. The question now is whether Toll can sustain that growth in the face of rising mortgage rates, as well as uncertainty created by the incoming White House administration. We'll be tracking Toll Brothers' results when they come out before the U.S. opening bell on Tuesday. Joe?
Coming up, President-elect Donald Trump has chosen former GOP presidential rival Ben Carson to be Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The latest on Trump's cabinet hunt is next. This is Bloomberg.
What'd you miss? Ben Carson has accepted Donald Trump's offer to lead the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi is calling this decision a, quote, disconcerting and disturbingly unqualified choice. She says, quote, there is no evidence that Dr. Carson brings the necessary credentials to hold a position with such immense responsibilities and impact on families and communities across America.
Joining us to discuss the latest on cabinet picks and visits to Trump Tower is Bloomberg News White House editor Alex Wayne. So, Ben Carson, Trump said a lot, you know, what's the story here? What's the deal?
A pediatric neurosurgeon. What more credentials do you want to run an agency that's responsible for billions of dollars in housing subsidies?
Alex, I want to go into, I have a few tweets that Donald Trump said at Ben Carson during the campaign. Let's take a look at a few. Here's one. It says, Ben Carson has never created a job in his life. Well, maybe a nurse. I've created tens of thousands of jobs. It's what I do. Here's another one. With Ben Carson wanting to hit his mother on the head with a hammer, stab a friend, and pyramids built for grain storage, don't people get it? And finally, the Carson story is either a total fabrication or, if true, even worse, trying to hit mother over the head
with a hammer or stabbing friends.
Sorry, I can't even get through all these three tweets.
Talk,
but you know, none of this matters, right? Because pretty much anyone who he's going to name for anything, we could probably go back and find a bunch of these equivalent tweets, right?
Yeah, you know, he's gonna name a bunch of his former opponents to jobs in his administration. Obviously, people do different things in campaigns than they do once they get in the office. Even now, the relationship between President Barack Obama and Donald Trump has changed significantly. They were at each other's throats all last year, or all this year, I guess, and now they're talking regularly about how to be president.
So there were reports initially that Ben Carson was kind of reluctant and didn't want to take this position. Do we have any sense of what might have pushed him over the edge in terms of accepting this position in the end?
famously, he said at one point, or maybe it was just through a spokesperson, that he wasn't qualified to work in government.
That was the quote.
I think that was through a spokesman, not Ben Carson himself. I think in this case, when the president-elect asks you to serve your country in any capacity, you consider it, and you probably take the job as long as it's especially if it's a cabinet position.
Alex, speaking of appointments, we're still waiting for the big one, or one of the big ones, which is Secretary of State. Report over the weekend that the search has expanded. Now hearing talk about John Huntsman, or maybe a former CEO of Exxon, Mitt Romney, who you've said if he's nominated, you're going to pay us each $1 or eat your hat or something. Where do things stand right now?
I think I'm going to get to keep my dollar.
You're feeling pretty good that the expansion means Romney's not going to get it?
Looks like Romney's out of the running. He's apparently Donald Trump didn't like the candidates he had in front of him, and so he's expanded the pool. You mentioned Rex Tillerson of Exxon is coming in. John Huntsman hasn't been scheduled for a meeting at Trump Tower yet, I don't believe, but his is another name on that list. That would surprise me a little bit because he was President Obama's ambassador to China, so that would be a funny kind of promotion.
Also, he would be extremely qualified to be Secretary of State compared to maybe some of the other names that we had seen floated before.
Can't argue with you there.
Yeah. There were reports that Donald Trump, in looking for cabinet positions and the right candidates, had said that he's looking for people who look the part. Can you explain what that means?
I cannot.
I mean, part of it was Mitt Romney looked the part of a Secretary of State. I think that was in that context.
I don't really want to get into Donald Trump's head too much. If I were a cynic, I would say that he thought Mitt Romney looked the part because he's a fairly handsome white man, I guess. I mean, but I want to think better of my president-elect and think that he had something else in mind. But I'm really not sure. I don't really know what he meant by that remark.
Let's talk about Trump's use of Twitter to make news. Obviously, there were the China tweets over the weekend, then more tweets about the protectionist stuff going after manufacturers. Another manufacturer in Indiana. What do other Republicans in D.C. feel about this? Are they just saying, hey, that's Donald Trump, that's what he's going to do, or are there any deeper misgivings?
The nice thing about his tweets is that when my phone buzzes at 6:30 in the morning, I'm pretty sure what's happening now. Republicans, along with everybody else in this town, are still trying to wrap their brains around how this new government is going to operate. He appears to be prepared to use social media in ways we've never seen before, certainly from a president. I mean, the platform hasn't been available before President Barack Obama, but Donald Trump appears to intend to use social media as one of his primary means of communication to the American public, and maybe even as a policy-making tool. So in my job, I'm going to have to pay very close attention to Donald Trump's Twitter feed for the next 4 years.
So people expect that he will be tweeting in the same capacity as like him dashing something off even after he's president. Is he going to get like a secure phone or something like that that's specifically designed to tweet safely?
So he'll inherit the @POTUS Twitter handle from Barack Obama when Obama leaves office. But @POTUS has a lot fewer followers than @RealDonaldTrump. So I think he's going to keep tweeting from his own personal handle, and he's given no indication otherwise.
All right, Alex Wayne of Bloomberg News, White House editor, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Coming up next, the annual Breakthrough Prize celebrates the top achievements in the fields of physics, life sciences, and mathematics. We'll be hearing from the founder of the ceremony, Yuri Milner, next. This is Bloomberg. What'd you miss? Bloomberg Technology is moving to a new time. Starting today, the San Francisco-based program will begin at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, which is about 10 minutes from now. Joining us now is Bloomberg tech anchor Emily Chang. Emily, what have we got to look forward to on the show today?
Hey there, Scarlett. Well, first of all, very excited about our new awesome lead-in from you and Joe. And What'd You Miss? Proud to be following the What'd You Miss team and excited to be moving an hour earlier, closer to the markets. We'll be live during the tech company earnings call, so very excited to bring you new and special content. Today, we've got a great show coming up. We're going to be talking about Uber just buying a new artificial intelligence startup to integrate AI into the Uber platform. First, to potentially improve the matching of drivers and riders, to improve food delivery routes, to potentially integrate speech and recognition software. We're going to be talking to Eric Newcomer, our Uber reporter, about that. We're also going to be touching on the mobile game that is giving Pokemon Go a run for its money coming out of Sony. Fate Grand Order actually seeing some big success, bringing in more money than Pokemon Go on both Android and iOS several days a year. I also attended the Breakthrough Prize ceremony last night here in Silicon Valley. This is the prize that was founded by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Russian billionaire investor Yuri Milner, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, and Wojcicki of 23andMe, to fund and award breakthroughs in the sciences as opposed to technology. All of these people know how money can empower technologists to make technological breakthroughs. They want to do the same for science. So I got to sit down with Yuri Milner and Anne Wojcicki last night, and we'll be bringing you those interviews.
Yeah, let's hear a little bit more about what Yuri Milner had to say. He's the founder of DST Global. What did you learn from him?
So Yuri Milner, fascinating guy from Russia originally, a physicist himself, one of the earliest investors in Twitter and Facebook. I tried really hard to get him to share his thoughts on the election of Donald Trump and talk about some of the diplomatic issues arising now between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Russia, and he deferred on that, saying that he's not a policy expert, but that the one thing he knows is that the forward march of technology cannot be stopped by a single election. We then went on to talk about, well, what does this mean for the global economy, especially the global tech economy? Take a listen to what he had to say.
In the last 10 years, there were $2 trillion worth of value created around the world, two-thirds in the U.S., 25% in China, and then the rest in the rest of the world. So my prediction is that in the next 10, 20 years, this trend will continue, and many more trillions of dollars will be created in this exciting space. So I'm not good at short-term predictions. What's going to happen next year? But I would bet that in the next 10, 20 years, we will see a lot of value coming out of places like Silicon Valley, Beijing, Tel Aviv, London, Bangalore.
Yuri Milner there, a guy with very lofty ambitions. He says he's spending about 40% of his time and funds in the United States. 40% of his investments are going into China. The rest mostly focused on Europe. He's spending very little time in Russia these days. And then this is a guy who is incredibly ambitious. He recently contributed $100 million to find extraterrestrial life, which he believes is possible, that we may make such a discovery in our lifetimes.
And Emily, there's a lot of interest in how Silicon Valley obviously sees this election. Tech stocks have underperformed since the election, and there were no tech CEOs on that job council that Donald Trump has put together. What's the perspective out there for how things are going so far?
Yeah, so I think Silicon Valley is still warming up to the idea of President Trump. Silicon Valley was very vocal about their lack of support for Trump. I spoke with Anne Wojcicki, who did endorse Hillary Clinton. She's the CEO of 23andMe. She was fairly optimistic that she's very much wait and see at this moment, but her company, a genetic testing startup, could presumably be very affected by the policies of a Trump administration when it comes to things like drug prices, funding for science and innovation, and the Affordable Care Act. Take a listen to what she had to say about that.
The benefit of Affordable Care Act is that there are millions of Americans who are saying, wow, it's like great to have health care. And I think without a doubt, it will be hard. People want to have those benefits. People want to actually feel empowered to actually take charge of their health. I'm open-minded, eager to see what's going to happen, but I know that once those people have gotten actually their health care, it's going to be hard to take it away from them.
And so Susan Wojcicki, and of course she will be on Bloomberg West with Emily Chang, Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang a little bit later on. Thank you so much, Emily. And you can get more of today's top tech headlines on Bloomberg Tech with Emily Chang, again, airing now at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific.
Coming up, what you need to know for tomorrow's trading day. This is Bloomberg.
An update for stocks with the Dow closing at an all-time high.
And the Reserve Bank of Australia tonight, 10:30 p.m., expected to hold.
That's all for What You Missed. Thanks for watching.
Have a great evening. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Nina Melendez, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word news. Former Vice President Al Gore was at Trump Tower in New York City today. He met with President-elect Donald Trump in what Gore said was a lengthy and very productive session. Earlier, Gore sat down with Ivanka Trump reportedly to discuss global warming. In 2007, Gore shared a Nobel Peace Prize with the UN International Panel on Climate Change. In a victory for protesters, the Army Corps of Engineers refused to grant an easement to allow an oil pipeline in North Dakota to be built under a lake. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe and its supporters argue that it threatened their water source and cultural sites. A mistrial has been declared in the case of a white former police officer charged with murder in the shooting of a black man in South Carolina. The jury was unable to unanimously agree on a verdict for Michael Slager. Cell phone video taken by a bystander sparked national outrage. Authorities have raised the death toll from that massive blaze in Oakland this weekend to 36. Firefighters expect to find more bodies in the ruins of the warehouse known as the Ghost Ship. Up to 100 people may have been inside the building when the fire erupted. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nina Melendez. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology is next.
I'm Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology at our new time, 2 p.m. here in San Francisco, 5 p.m. in New York, 6 a.m. in Hong Kong. Coming up, EU watchdogs send a message to big tech. Move faster to crack down on hate speech, or we will do it for you. Plus, the best of the best in science getting the celebrity treatment in Silicon Valley. It is the 5th annual Breakthrough Prize Awards. We will hear from Russian billionaire investor Yuri Milner, who helped start it. And are science and technology on the priority list for the new administration? 23andMe CEO Anne Wojcicki joins me at the Breakthrough Awards for insight on the road ahead with Trump in the driver's seat. But first, to our lead. EU regulators are warning U.S. tech giants to act faster against online hate speech or face laws that would force their hand. Remember, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube banded together 6 months ago by signing a voluntary code of conduct. In it, they said they support EU regulators, quote, in the effort to respond to the challenge of ensuring that online platforms do not offer opportunities for illegal online hate speech to spread virally. They went on to say they'd review the majority of valid notifications for removal of illegal hate speech in less than 24 hours and remove or disable access to such content if necessary. Now, 6 months later, EU regulators say these companies aren't living up to their promise and that only 40% of cases are addressed in less than 24 hours. Joining us now to discuss the problems facing these companies as they try to balance regulation and free speech, Heroic Ventures managing partner Michael Furtick in Palo Alto. Also with us here in the studio all the way from Berlin, Bloomberg's Carolyn Hyde, anchor of The Open, who covers a lot of European technology for us as well. So, Carolyn, I want to start with you. Talk to us about what's going on with European regulators. I mean, obviously, they are not getting this stuff offline in 24 hours and sometimes not even close.
And therefore, they want to see potentially the threat of legislation to come in and force the hand of these large US companies. As you said, 40%, just 40% of the alerts, about 600 have so far been in place in the last 6 months. 40% of them been tackled in 24 hours. Now, much more are being tackled 80% in 48 hours. So they're saying, look, it's not that you can't do it. You're not putting enough resources behind this. You are billion, trillion-dollar companies. You should be able to put more resources behind this. But it's notable, Emily, no wonder this is being viewed by the EU at the moment. Terror attacks have occurred, of course, we know, notably in France. You've had the refugee crisis. Just in November, Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany herself, said she was thinking, potentially lending support to regulation to reduce hate speech because she feels that's behind this wave of populism that drove the Italian election, the referendum loss.
Right. And the numbers are even different there, correct?
Exactly. I think that's what's so notable. Not only is the speed slow, but it's also particularly slow in some of the countries that Angela Merkel and EU are most worried about. Italy, get this, just 4% of the alerts about hate speech are tackled within 24 hours. 4% when it's meant to be 100%. In Austria, 11%. Now, over the weekend as well, we saw this is a country that very closely had a notably far-right presidential candidate winning.